does Augustine do? He says, you want a city and a society of justice and peace. But polytheism cannot give you that. Your own beliefs will undermine your aspirations. And he says, in fact, your highest aspirations show that your beliefs are wrong. And so what he did, he was critique the very foundations of pagan thinking and culture. And so we have to do. When I call it high theory, some of you know that the idea of theory nowadays, high theory now means a critique of culture, a way of explaining the culture. And I don't want to get tedious here, but I also don't want to, I want to be clear. I want to talk long enough to be clear, but not so long as to be tedious. You know, would you all pray for me right now? But look, a good book that does some of this recently is a book by Patrick Deneen, a Catholic academic from Notre Dame. And he wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed. And I'm not sure that's the best. When you think of liberalism, you're probably not thinking about what he means, but here's what his point was. He says the word liberalism has the word liberty in it. And that all cultures have believed in liberty. The Greeks and the Romans and Christians have always believed, and the Jews always believed liberty was very important. Freedom was very important. But he says modern society has added something to the classic understanding of freedom. Because the classic understanding of freedom was freedom to do what you ought to do. But what modern society has done is this. In order to make you more free, they thought, modern thinkers, in order to make you more free, they have, I'll use a big word here, they have disembedded the individual from the transcendent, from nature, and from the community. What that means is, what they have said is, there is no supernatural transcendent world. And therefore, you don't have to submit your reason to revelation like the Bible. Because everything has a natural explanation, everything has a scientific explanation, and therefore you do not have to bow your reason to anything. No revelation from God, see? Or secondly, when it says disembedded the individual from nature, in the past we always said, yes, you have to be free, but you also have to recognize the givenness of nature. There are certain things that are natural to us, but modern people say, what your body says doesn't matter. It's what you feel inside. And you change nature to fit your desires. You never adapt to nature. Never. You make nature do what you want. So the individual is no longer under nature, no longer under supernatural, and the individual is no longer under the community. In the old days, freedom meant the freedom to serve your family, but now it means the freedom to be an individual, and you can tell your family where to get off if your family doesn't meet your needs. And that's the modern idea of freedom. And here's the critique, right? Our high theory is going to have to show this. If that is, and that's the modern idea of freedom, it's not the biblical idea of freedom. The biblical idea of freedom is very different. That modern idea of freedom leads to five disastrous results. It means all values now are relative. It means all relationships are now transactional. All values are relative. All relationships are transactional. All identities are hyper-fragile. Hyper-fragile. All supposed sources of fulfillment are disappointing. And in the end, we're still not free. Now, to work through those five things would be you're beginning to do a high Christian theory. You're beginning to show that exactly what Augustine said. And that is that the modern understanding of reality doesn't fit in with human nature. It doesn't fit in with what you want. It does mean all values are relative. You know what that means, don't you? How do you talk about justice when everything's relative? Right? How do you even, and also, we're always changing. Let me go out and, some of you may be going to sleep, so I'll wake you up with this one. But don't tweet this, okay? When I was in college, which shows how long ago this was, when I was in college, didn't go to Christian college, but when I went to college, professors were having sex with their students all the time. And if you thought that was bad or wrong, you were an absolute prude. You were worse than that, okay? You were a bigot. What's the matter with you? Okay. Now, for my grandparents and my parents, the idea of faculty having sex with their students would have been horrendous and you would have lost your job. Guess what? Now, 40 years later, 50 years later, if faculty have sex with their students, they're going to lose their job again, right? In other words, the thing that when I was a kid was absolutely fine, today, it's terrible. My parents, it was terrible. When I was a kid, it was okay. Now it's terrible again. Who knows what it's going to be in 30 years? Who knows that the things that right now everybody thinks are terrible, 30 years from now, they're going to laugh at you. That's a rudderless society. That's a morally rudderless society. There's nothing up here by which we're judging right or wrong anymore. See, all values are relative. Then secondly, all relationships are transactional. What do I mean by that? Well, I recently read a book by a secular person who said, she was trying to explain why so many people were not having children. You do know that even in America now, our birth rate is going down and down. And here's what she said. She said, we have been taught in modern society that all relationships are transactional, including marriage. That means you don't ever get into a relationship and say, well, I've got to stay in there. In other words, I only stay in a relationship as long as it's benefiting me. It's almost like, basically, it's the market. It's like you stay in a relationship with a vendor as long as it's making a profit for you. If it's not profitable, you get out. So all relationships are transactional. Here's what she said. There's a problem, though, with parenting. You can't divorce your 3-year-old. In which cases, a lot of people are going to say, well, I'm not going to have a 3-year-old. I'm never going to have a child. Because I've got to have... See, the individual has been disembedded from community. My needs are more real than the needs of the community or the demands of the community, right? And as a result, families are people are not getting married, people are not having children. It's going to get worse. It's going to get more so. And not only that, but you have political fragmentation. You've got you have a loss of neighborhood. There's all sorts of things. Individualism of modern society is breaking things down. I'm not going to keep on this. You see, there's got to be a critique. And it's got to be a radical critique. And you've got to say, you've got these beliefs and they're not working. All values are relative. All relationships are transactional. All identities are fragile because we don't know who we are. Let me just say something about that because we're going to get back to this later and tomorrow. Charles Taylor has a great book called Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. And he points out that ancient identities were porous. That what he meant was that if there was a God, you felt the pull of God. If there was a family, you felt the pull of the family. In other words, the demands of God and family and country and moral truth were so important that you rearranged what was happening on the inside. Okay? You rearranged what was happening on the inside. That is if this is the truth and this is what God wants, this is what my family wants, well, I'm going to change inside. No longer. Charles Taylor says the modern self is what he calls a buffered self, a hard-coded self. There's a hard coating over us. And what that means is we don't actually feel the pull of what God says. We don't feel the pull of what the family says because your feelings now are more real than anything outside. Got that? Your feelings are more real than anything outside. So what that means is I validate myself. I decide what is right or wrong for me. Nobody can assign value or worth to me. I decide who I want to be, and I bestow dignity on myself. But as Charles Taylor in that book says, we are irreducibly relational creatures, and we can't live that way. You can tell yourself, oh no, I'm going to define myself, but you can't live that way. And what that means is the modern self is so fragile because what happens is we go inside and we decide who we are, and then we come outside and we demand that everybody accept us the way we are. And what that means is we spend all of our lives desperately needing affirmation. We cannot live just affirming ourselves. And we're going to need constant affirmation. And this is the reason why people melt down when they even have a discussion. Because there's this great need for affirmation. This is the reason why the modern self is so fragile, because, in traditional cultures, your father and your mother said, this is what I want you to be, and that could be actually pretty domineering, and some of you have come from those cultures where what the parents said was what went. But if your parents thought, you're a good son or a good daughter, then you thought, okay, I guess I'm a good person. But in modern, that's not that hard to live up to. I mean, there are some unreasonable fathers and mothers, and some of you have them, I'm sorry. But by and large, that's not something you have to live up to. But the modern self, you've got to be beautiful. You've got to be powerful. You've got to reach your dreams. You've got to change the world. You've got to make money. You've got to be successful. And it's crushing. High theory means we tell the culture that the very basis of their own beliefs are killing them. You do what Augustine did. You don't just say, well, yeah, here's the evidence of resurrection. I'm great on that. I love that. I'm all for that. But first you got to show them that their own beliefs don't work before you show them that your beliefs are so rational.